Imagine being a wife whose husband is fighting the Germans only to be forced to work side by side with a German prisoner of war who helped build the U-boats. In 1944, on the sweltering docks of Mississippi, the war wasn't fought with bullets, but with the arc of a welding torch, and the greatest weapon was trust. The Pascagoula River Shipyard in the summer of 1944 did not operate on human energy. It operated on raw, brute noise. The sound was a metallic symphony of American industrial might. The air compressors shrieking, the drop hammers slamming, and the constant, furious, percussive thwack of riveting guns shaping plates of steel into the unyielding hulls of Liberty ships. The Gulf Coast heat was a palpable blanket, clinging to the skin and mixing with the smell of wet paint and coal smoke. Inside this mechanical whirlwind, the sheer scale of the operation was overwhelming. A single Liberty ship used over 5,000 individual steel plates, each requiring miles of precise welds. Estelle Ellie Vance, known universally as the fastest welder in Section 3, worked with a steady, fierce concentration. Every flicker of the arc, every bead of molten metal, was a direct investment in winning the war. Her husband was thousands of miles away in the Pacific, fighting the very enemy who had designed the vessel that sank his first carrier. She was a sentinel against the anxieties of the home front, focused only on meeting the yard's impossible launch schedule. But, as hot as the torches burned, the atmosphere in Pascagoula that summer was chilling. Hundreds of German prisoners of war had been brought in to fill the dire labor shortage left by millions of American men serving overseas. They were U-boat crewmen, mechanics, and clerks, dressed in simple faded khaki fatigues marked with the white PW stamped on the back. For the local workers, they were ghosts, figures of deep resentment and fear, a constant silent reminder of the war and its terrible human cost. The prisoners were kept segregated, confined behind a thick, visible rope barrier, never to be spoken to. The American workers often shared grim news from overseas, making the presence of the prisoners a constant bitter weight. In one detail, kept farthest from the skilled welding line, was a young man named Klaus Richter. He was 21 years old, a former engine room apprentice captured when his U-boat was forced to surface off the Atlantic coast. To Ellie, he and his comrades looked lost, pale, skinny, and entirely out of place amidst the hurricane of American manufacturing. They spent their days hauling heavy cables or clearing scrap metal. Klaus found the constant roar overwhelming. Back home in Hamburg, he had known the precise, delicate work of the engine block, where a millimeter-sized flaw could spell disaster. Here, everything was massive, loud, and done at a frenzied pace. He watched the efficiency of the American shipyard with a mixture of professional awe and bitter realization. His nation's propaganda about lazy democracies seemed a cruel joke here. Klaus was a figure of fear and pity, someone whose technical training had been applied to the efforts of war against her own husband. The simple line of rope separating them was the only thing preventing a lifetime of propaganda and bitterness from colliding. It was a rule she was determined to keep, but the desperate need of the shipyard for skilled hands was about to change the rules of the war, beginning with her. The roar of the shipyard could not mask the sinking dread in the pit of Ellie Vance's stomach. A critical inspection tag, bright red and marked "Reject," had been placed squarely over her most recent run of welds on the No. 4 cargo hold. The bright red color of the tag seemed to mock the endless hours she had poured into the steel. The Liberty ship program was the backbone of the Allied supply line. Delays were unthinkable and errors were unforgivable. Mr. Henderson, the yard foreman, stormed over, the vibrations from his heavy boots shaking the decking. Ellie, the pride of Section 3, was slowing the launch. The welds lacked penetration, they were strong on the surface but weak at the core, a failure of stamina caused by the unforgiving Mississippi heat and the sheer exhausting volume of work. She felt the fatigue in her shoulders and in the involuntary tremor of her hands, a flaw that was invisible to the eye but obvious to the inspection tools. The failure felt like a betrayal of her effort. Henderson knew she was the best welder he had. Her hands were tired, and finding a qualified replacement for the fire watch was impossible. The schedule was tight, the pressure was immense, and the need for manpower had become so acute that the military had already suspended one of the most sacred rules of the shipyard. He had argued with the War Department liaison, emphasizing the absurdity, but the official orders came down. Use the available labor. Henderson stood staring at the reject tag, then glanced toward the far end of the dock where the German prisoners of war were slowly, methodically clearing a pile of steel scrap. Henderson fought a painful ethical battle for a long moment, watching the enemy, his potential solution, standing idle. He walked past Ellie without a word, crossing the wide expanse of the shipyard until he reached the guards watching the prisoner detail. The guard motioned to the small group, and one figure in the faded khaki uniform stepped forward. It was Klaus Richter. The absurdity of the situation hit her with the force of a rivet gun. The very men they were building ships to sink were now being brought in to help build them. Klaus was led through the shipyard, past dozens of American workers who stopped their jobs to stare, their expressions ranging from shock to open fury. He tried to make his steps precise, ignoring the stares, but felt the raw hostility settle over him like a physical weight. The guard spoke to Henderson, who simply pointed at Ellie. "You are the fire watch," the foreman instructed Klaus. "She welds. You watch the sparks. You don't speak. You don't touch the equipment. You do exactly what she tells you." He gave Ellie a brief terse nod. "He's your assistant, Vance. Don't talk to him. Just make that weld right." The ultimate American pragmatism had overcome a lifetime of cultural conditioning. Ellie was left standing on the steel deck plate, holding a faulty torch and facing a German enemy who was now her required assistant. The unspoken hostility of the entire shipyard had been distilled into the 6 feet of space between them. The question was not how to finish the ship, but how to share the most intimate of industrial labors, welding with the enemy. The morning air was thick with humidity and unspoken animosity. Ellie Vance arrived at her station. She walked past Klaus Richter as if he were another piece of equipment, pausing only to drop a heavy, empty bucket and a shovel at his feet. She pointed to the ground where sparks would fall and then, curtly, toward the fire extinguisher. Klaus understood. He was the fire watch, the essential, yet despised, human safety net. He stood rigidly at attention, his eyes scanning the deck for stray slag or dangerous embers, finding a momentary refuge in the precision of his official task. For the rest of the morning, a profound silence reigned between them, far heavier than the clanging chaos of the shipyard around them. The silence was a wall built of 2 nations' worth of fear and personal loss. Ellie communicated through the sharp rhythm of her work. Her focus was absolute, yet the vertical seam she needed to repair remained stubbornly difficult. Vertical up-welding requires a precise travel speed and immense forearm strength against gravity. Ellie shielded her eyes from the arc's blinding light and moved the torch, but her muscles were weary. The heat was draining her reserves. After 2 feet of what looked like flawless work, she pulled back her torch, a slight, telltale flicker running through the current, a momentary lapse in tempo. She knew instantly she had failed again. The molten metal had dipped microscopically, creating a weakness at the root. Klaus, despite the explicit order to keep his distance, was watching the arc with a concentration that mirrored her own. He saw the subtle ripple of the molten pool when her hand involuntarily twitched, a minuscule flaw caused by fatigue. It was a technical error that would earn another red tag. The remedy was a fractional change in the torch angle, a trick from German industrial training. He wrestled with himself. To speak to her, to offer advice, was to break the rules and risk confinement. To stand silent was to watch her effort fail again. Klaus felt the powerful, overriding compulsion of the craftsman to fix a flaw, regardless of who created it or who benefited from its correction. Ellie yanked her mask up, letting out a heavy, frustrated sigh that disappeared instantly into the wind. She stared at the challenging length of the hull, knowing she could not sustain the weld's integrity for the full distance. Her hands ached. She thought of the soldiers this ship was meant to carry, of the war that had taken the lives of so many men, and she felt a wave of profound exhaustion wash over her. For the sake of the weld, she was forced to try the difficult section again, determined to conquer the steel on her own. The afternoon sun turned the steel deck into a shimmering griddle, but the heat of the day was nothing compared to the burn of humiliation Ellie felt. She tried the difficult vertical weld again and again. The final inspection light revealed the lack of penetration. In a flash of raw, overwhelming fatigue, she tore off her welding hood and slammed it down, the sharp clank echoing across the open bay, announcing her defeat. Ellie slumped against the hull, rubbing the sweat and soot from her eyes. She saw only the face of her husband thousands of miles away and the weight of every sacrifice that she was making to bring him home. This momentary vulnerability was the first break in her relentless composure since the war began. It was during this fragile moment that the silence from the fire watch position finally broke. Klaus Richter, moving with cautious, almost painful slowness, took a splintered piece of wood and dropped to one knee. He looked briefly at Ellie, then began to draw. In the dust and grime of the steel deck, he sketched out a quick, small diagram. A simple angle, an arrow pointing to the electrode, and a fractional degree of correction. He did not speak a single word. He simply tapped the drawing, then pointed back to the weld. He then immediately returned to his assigned post, his breathing shallow, fully expecting a military guard to appear and confine him for the infraction. Ellie stared at the drawing. It was so precise, so fundamentally correct in its engineering logic, that it struck her like a physical blow. It addressed the exact flaw that fatigue had introduced. It was the quiet language of a master craftsman seeing a shared technical problem. Her mind raced with a terrible conflict. To accept his help was to admit defeat to the enemy. To refuse his help was to fail her country and risk the entire schedule. American pragmatism, born of the necessity of war, won out over pride. Slowly, Ellie picked up her torch. She only glanced at the diagram one last time, absorbing the single perfect instruction. Without a word of thanks, she adjusted the angle of her electrode holder by the precise amount Klaus had indicated. She pulled the hood down and fired the torch. This time, the weld was different. The molten pool stayed exactly where it needed to be, defying gravity. Her hands, guided by the subtle correction, found a new rhythm, steady and strong. The entire seam was completed in a single, flawless run. The foreman, Mr. Henderson, arrived. He scanned the weld with his instruments, then tore off the red reject tag and replaced it with a white pass. Ellie had conquered the steel, but the man responsible for the technical victory was standing silently behind her. This unexpected collaboration was the first silent crack in the wall of wartime hatred. The following morning, the unspoken rules of the shipyard had subtly but profoundly shifted. The silence between Ellie and Klaus was no longer one of malice. It was the quiet shared by two people who had recognized a mutual skill. Ellie had brought a second thermos, heavy with scalding black coffee. She set it down by the edge of the welding platform and gave Klaus a barely perceptible nod toward it. This was a calculated, professional acknowledgement. Klaus understood. He waited until she was fully focused, then picked up the thermos and poured a cup. He tasted the bitter, potent American coffee and felt a fragile pinprick of recognition. He was a co-worker. Over the next few days, their relationship settled into a fluid, efficient partnership. They communicated through the precise language of the shop floor. They didn't need to speak English or German. A tap on a spanner, a pointed finger toward a measurement, or a specific nod sufficed. Ellie began to notice that Klaus moved with an ingrained efficiency, a respect for tools that came not from a uniform, but from a trade. He had spent his young life in the industrial suburbs of Hamburg, an apprentice in one of the world's most advanced shipyards. Now he was applying that passion to the very war machine built to defeat his nation. He saw the ship as a beautiful, complex machine. His job was not to question its purpose, but to ensure its physical integrity. Ellie began to see him not as a symbol of the enemy, but as a shadow of her own husband, a young man who knew how to work. This realization was unsettling, a tear in the fabric of patriotic certainty. But the shipyard was relentless. Mr. Henderson returned one crisp morning. He pointed to a set of massive steel components near the waterline, the propeller shaft housing. "Vance," he said, "this is the hardest bit. No room for error. You'll be on it starting tomorrow." The pressure was immense. The propeller housing was the structural heart of the vessel. Ellie glanced at Klaus. The job required two people working in absolute perfect tandem. The war machine now needed the German apprentice as much as it needed the American Rosie. The real test of their silent truce was about to begin. The first moment of accidental shared humanity arrived in a flash of pain. Klaus stumbled, and his bare hand instinctively braced himself on a piece of steel that was still searing hot from the torch. A gasp escaped his lips. Ellie, without a moment's thought, reacted. She grabbed a clean rag, dipped it quickly into a tin of cooling salve, and pressed it firmly against the red, blistering patch on Klaus's palm. Her touch was firm and non-judgmental. Klaus stared at her. He tried to pull away, but Ellie's grip was steady. She released him. The barrier between them had just been breached by an act of care. Ellie decided to teach him. This was the ultimate act of American confidence, trusting that skill transcended nationality. She started small, using pantomime. She demonstrated the specific angle and speed required for the overhead pass. Then she handed the torch to him. Klaus hesitated. He knew the risk, but the pull of the trade was stronger than fear. He adjusted the helmet, fired the arc, and followed Ellie's detailed instructions. She guided his hand, her gauntlet lightly pressing against his, correcting his grip and movement. The heat from the arc radiated between them. The ethical weight of the moment was immense. Here, on the deck of a warship designed to cause the loss of life for his comrades, an American patriot was teaching an enemy essential skills. She explained the settings in short, clear English words, faster, slower, tighter, and Klaus translated her intent instantly through the heat and the metal's response. Yet, the only reality that mattered was the beautiful, steady hiss of the perfect weld Klaus was laying down. The German training had given him the knowledge. Ellie gave him the technique. They were simply two artisans, bound by the universal brotherhood of steel. The day of the propeller housing weld arrived with the quiet tension reserved for the most critical moments. The entire shipyard understood the stakes. Word had spread. Workers from neighboring sections began to gather. They had come to watch the spectacle. Ellie Vance, working in tandem with the German prisoner of war whom she had impossibly taken on as her apprentice. Ellie put on her heavy helmet, cutting off the noise of the crowd. Klaus stood beside her, his focus absolute. They began the weld. Ellie struck the arc. What followed was a silent, intense ballet of fire. The weld was an intricate, multi-layered job. Ellie took the lead. Klaus was the essential anchor. He tracked the heat signature, ready to cool any section instantly, and fed the wire with impeccable, steady timing that Ellie had never achieved with any other partner. They communicated not with words, but with the tapping of an electrode, the tilt of a helmet, and the shared, precise rhythm of the craft. The crowd watched in stunned silence. The sheer noise of the Pascagoula shipyard began to diminish as sections fell quiet. They were watching a perfect fusion of skill where neither pride nor prejudice held any sway. Klaus, applying the fine finishing pass as Ellie had taught him, worked the torch with a delicate, beautiful precision. The final bead was so smooth and uniform it looked less like a weld and more like a line drawn by a master engraver. For Ellie, the welding arc melted away the uniform and the nationality. She saw Klaus's commitment to excellence and realized it was no different from her own. For Klaus, Ellie was a teacher, a colleague. Their shared purpose transcended all the propaganda. Finally, the arc died. They lifted their helmets and stood side by side in the profound quiet of the surrounding crowd. Mr. Henderson, the foreman, pushed his way through. He scanned the seams, then let out a deep breath of relief. "That," he announced, "is a perfect run. Tightest shaft weld we've had all year." The success was a validation of the impossible trust required to make it. The German prisoner had just earned his place in the American war effort through skill, dismantling years of conditioning with a single, perfect seam of steel. The scent of salt air and molten steel had become a comforting perfume on the shipyard for Ellie Vance. In early spring of 1945, the air carried the scent of closure. For Ellie and Klaus, the work continued in a state of quiet grace. But one afternoon, the routine was shattered. Mr. Henderson approached the platform with military police officers. "Vance," he said, "the POW labor program is changing. They're reassigning all German personnel to inland camps starting tomorrow." The message was final. Ellie simply nodded. The loss of her silent partner was a jarring reminder of reality. Klaus was not a colleague, he was a captive. She watched Klaus absorb the news, his face impassive. The military police were courteous but firm, closing the door on the truce with a bureaucratic swiftness that emphasized the fleeting nature of their shared time. That evening, as the shadows lengthened, Ellie approached their workstation. Klaus was gathering his meager possessions. Ellie pulled a heavy canvas bag from beneath the bench. Inside were two items, a photograph of the Pascagoula Hope and a tiny, perfectly fused piece of scrap steel, polished until it shone. She held out the gifts. Klaus took them. He looked her directly in the eye, and in a thick, carefully articulated voice, spoke the few words of English he had learned. "Thank you, teacher," Klaus said. "Good luck." Ellie swallowed. She lifted her hand to the brim of her welding cap and executed a quick, crisp military salute. It was her final, silent acknowledgement of his dignity and their impossible partnership. When the truck rolled in before dawn, taking Klaus away, he looked back only once. He saw Ellie Vance already at her post, her helmet down, a powerful woman who had taught an enemy that the universal language of craftsmanship could overcome the brutality of war. The morning the Pascagoula Hope was scheduled to launch, the air was clear. Ellie stood on the dock as the great ship, 3,500 tons of steel and purpose, slid down the ways with a triumphant roar. Her eyes drifted to the propeller housing, the exact spot where she and Klaus had labored. That seam was a testament not just to American manufacturing power, but to the power of shared human skill. It occurred to her that the war was won in the quiet day-to-day decisions to value competence over hatred. The European conflict soon reached its conclusion. With the war over, the industrial machine that had driven Ellie began to slow. The Rosies were encouraged to return to their homes. Ellie packed her gear. Her identity, defined by the arc of fire, was suddenly ambiguous. She tried to return to her previous life, but the memory of the German prisoner felt more real than the domestic routine she was expected to embrace. The experience had cracked her patriotic certainty. The sudden silence of her old life, absent the rhythmic thwack of the yard, felt unnerving and empty. Her husband returned, injured, but alive. They settled into a life where the shipyard felt like a fading dream. She thought often of Klaus, wondering where the prisoner of war had been sent, if he had survived the repatriation process back to a Germany that was now rubble. She knew the destruction of German cities was far worse than anything experienced on the American home front, and the thought that his skills might be wasted in the ruins weighed heavily on her. She kept the tiny, polished piece of Weld metal he had left with her, a physical token of their unspoken pact. The world was at peace, but Ellie knew that the most profound change had happened inside her. More than 10 years after the war ended, Ellie's life felt settled, yet incomplete. She was often haunted by the question of what had become of her silent partner from Pascagoula. She had resigned herself to the fact that Klaus was simply a ghost of the war, a face she would never see again. Then, in the mid-1950s, a thick, official-looking envelope arrived. It was addressed to Ellie Vance, former welder, Pascagoula Shipyard. The return address was Hamburg, Germany. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter inside was from Klaus Richter. His writing was clear and precise, reflecting his engineering training. He wrote that he had been repatriated, found his hometown devastated, but had used the skills she had reinforced to help rebuild. He was now a successful engineer, working in the very yards where he had first apprenticed. He spoke of the lessons she had taught him, not just in welding technique, but in the American concept of practical fairness. He explained that the memory of her trust, given when he was an enemy, was the most important building block he carried back to the ruins of Germany. He had succeeded in a land of ruins because he remembered the dignity she had extended to him. He closed with a profound and stunning proposal, a partnership. He wanted to open an international trade school, specializing in high-stress fusion welding, a place where the young people of two nations could learn a shared language of skill. He wrote that the school needed a master welder with American grit and industrial genius, and that there was only one person in the world who fit the job. The proposition was stunning. The ultimate vindication of the kindness she had shown him, the ultimate victory of their professional bond over the history that had tried to tear them apart. Ellie knew instantly that she would say yes. The ultimate expression of their shared belief was inscribed in simple, elegant steel above a doorway in the industrial heart of Stuttgart, Germany, Vance and Richter International Metal Arts. Ellie Vance accepted the proposal immediately. In the mid-1950s, she and her husband moved to Germany. The school was a testament to impossible reconciliation, funded by the profits of a German engineer and an American Rosie. Their curriculum was rigorous, combining American industrial efficiency with German craftsmanship. They taught young apprentices not just how to fuse metal, but how to respect the machine, the material, and the person standing next to them. Ellie ensured every student understood the critical importance of a perfect fire watch. A silent nod to Klaus and their beginning. The story of the school's founders became a quiet legend. Ellie never spoke of battles or patriotism. She spoke of the day a young German prisoner of war risked punishment to show an exhausted American woman how to achieve a perfect quarter-inch weld. She spoke of the coffee shared and the ultimate silent truce forged beneath the massive hull of the Pascagoula Hope. Klaus, now older, was the perfect partner. He ran the engineering division, his face alight with pride as he watched the new generation of American and German students work together. He always kept the tiny polished piece of steel from the propeller housing on his desk, a constant reminder of their origin story. Their success was a quiet, powerful form of diplomacy. It demonstrated that true partnership could emerge from the ruins of conflict. Students found themselves collaborating in the intense, precise work of the fusion arc, discovering that their shared dreams of building were identical. The school did more to bridge the gap between the two nations than any treaty. One afternoon, Ellie and Klaus stood side by side on the shop floor. They watched a young German student and an American student bent over a complicated joint, communicating in a fast, fluid mix of English, German, and shop floor gestures, the precise, unspoken language they themselves had pioneered. The world was at peace, and the perfect weld she and Klaus had laid down was long since sailing the world's oceans, carrying goods, not guns, a fitting symbol of the truce forged by a Rosie and a POW. Their story reminds us that even in the most intense crucible of hatred, skill finds common ground, and decency can bloom in the most impossible of places. The legacy of Vance and Richter, the American woman and the German man, remains a testament to the powerful, unifying language of craftsmanship.